A few months into my burnout recovery, I remember waking up one morning and looking at my to-do list. And there was really not very much on it because I had already accepted by then I could not go back to pushing myself the way I used to. But there was a problem I had never really thought about before. If pushing myself was no longer going to be the way I live, how was I supposed to get anything done? You see, for most part of my life, I had really only known this one way. And if there was something that needed to be done, but I didn't have the energy for it, I would just push through. Tired, get on with it. Overwhelmed, well, don't be a wimp. Can't concentrate, try harder. And for years, that had actually worked. Until one day, it didn't. In my last video, I talked about the autistic burnout that forced me to bring that way of life to an end. But recovery left me with a question I had never really had to answer before. If I could no longer force myself through life, what was I supposed to do instead? And I think at first, part of me was still looking for another system that would give me the same result, maybe a better discipline or a better routine, maybe the right productivity method, something that would get me functioning and productive consistently again. But slowly, I began to realize that I was still asking the same old question, and that is, how I make myself perform. But what I actually need is to ask a completely different question. The first thing that changed was actually very small. I started checking in with my body. How am I really doing today? What am I feeling in this moment? How does my body need right now to feel a little bit more grounded and centered? And I mean right now, not what are my goals for the next 6 months or what sort of person do I want to become, but just what do I need in this moment? Maybe I have not eaten properly. Maybe I'm thirsty. Maybe I need an hour without speaking to anyone. Maybe I have been sitting at my desk for too long and I need to go outside. Maybe I'm actually tired. That sounds incredibly basic, but I realized I had spent years being much better at noticing what needed to be done externally than noticing what I need internally. I noticed an unanswered email almost straight away. I noticed a deadline miles away. I noticed if somebody else seemed unhappy with me. But I could apparently go half a day without noticing I was hungry. So I started carving out little spaces during my day where I intentionally check in with my body. Not because every feeling needed to control what I did next, but because my body was finally being allowed into the conversation. And that led to another uncomfortable discovery. Because when I started listening properly, I began noticing the way I spoke to myself whenever my body did not give me the answer I wanted. Why are you tired again? Why can't you concentrate? You have hardly done anything today. Everyone else manage it. And I realized something I would never speak to anyone I love in this manner. So a change is needed. And this is what I did. I print out a photograph of my younger self when I was 4 years old, and I stick the picture on my bathroom mirror so that I could see my younger self every morning. And when I see her in the morning, I would say something very kind to her. Or nothing really grand, but small things like, "You are doing okay today. You don't have to prove anything today. I am going to look after you today." And gradually, I began to notice that the inner voice I talked to myself with really matters, because I could meet all my physical needs and still spend the whole day living with someone inside of me who was constantly criticizing me. But even when I became kinder to myself, there were still days I just couldn't bring myself to do what I planned to do. You learn to build your life around the body you actually have. I didn't understand that for most part of my life. I think somewhere in my head, I had treated my body a little bit like a computer. For example, if I had 8 hours available on Monday, then surely I had 8 hours of usable capacity. If I could concentrate well yesterday, I should be able to concentrate equally well today. If I had managed to something last week, I should be able to manage it again this week. And if I cannot, there must be something wrong with me. Maybe I was being lazy, maybe I needed more discipline, maybe I was not trying hard enough. But a human body is not a computer. We don't have a switch that gives us the same level of concentration, energy, and focus every day. Our bodies have rhythms. And may I say, women's bodies have hormone cycles as part of those rhythms too. I began to wonder whether some of what I had been interpreting as inconsistency might actually be the rhythm of my body. So I started to pay attention. I kept track of how my days went. For example, how was my energy? How well could I concentrate? What did I eat during the day? How much water had I drank? How much sleep did I have? How much social interaction have I had? Who had I spent time with? And after a while, I started to see things I had never noticed when I was simply judging every day as either productive or unproductive. There were certain kinds of social days after which I needed much more recovery time than I thought I should. And there were times when poor sleep affected me for longer than I expected. There were days when my concentrating was much easier at one time than another. And instead of seeing each difficult day as a personal failure, I began seeing patterns. That was quite a profound change for me, because once I could see a pattern, I did not have to turn every fluctuation into a judgment about my character or ability. I have less capacity today. It's a very different sentence from what's wrong with me today. But learning the pattern did not mean that I suddenly became good at respecting it. Sometimes I could see perfectly well that I was tired and still become annoyed with myself for being tired. Sometimes I knew I needed a quieter day and still felt guilty for taking one. Sometimes I caught myself thinking, surely I should be better at this by now. And that was when I realized how deep the old way of living was in me. I had spent decades learning to override my own body. I wasn't going to unlearn that just because I had bought a notebook and tracked my energy for 3 weeks. I needed patience. It's like a baby learning to walk. A baby falls over and gets up and falls over again. We don't look at the baby and say, well, clearly you are not very good at walking, because we understand that falling is part of learning for a baby. And yet, when I fell back into my old habits, pushing myself, comparing myself, speaking harshly to myself, I could immediately treat that as evidence that I had failed. I had spent my whole life living in one mode of being. Of course, learning another one was going to take time. But there was still one habit underneath almost all the others, one that could turn a perfectly ordinary low-energy day into evidence that I was doing life badly. I was still looking sideways at how others are doing. You learn to build your life around the body you actually have. Eventually, I realized that learning my own rhythm would not help very much if I kept judging the rhythm against somebody else's standard. For most of my life, I benchmarked myself with an external benchmark. How much can other people work? How easily do they maintain relationships? How much can they fit into a week? How consistently can they concentrate? Why can they do that and I cannot? After discovering that I am neurodivergent, there was another trap waiting for me. I could compare myself with other neurodivergent people instead. Someone else with ADHD can manage that. Another autistic person seems to cope with that. They have a full-time job, they have children, why can't I? It was the same habit, wearing different clothes. I was still using somebody else's life as the ruler of my own. And I began to see that if I kept doing that, I could learn everything there was to know about my own body and still never trust it. So the benchmark had to move. Back to the question I had started asking myself, how am I really doing today? What do I need in this moment? Back to noticing that my energy had a rhythm rather than demanding every day to look the same. Back to that photo of my younger self and the question of whether I would speak to her the way I sometimes spoke to myself. Back to the days when I fell into the old pattern again and had to remember that learning something new includes falling over. And slowly, the question changed. Instead of, why can I function like them? I started asking, how do I function? That is a much more interesting question because there is no shame in the answer. There is just information. Maybe I can do 3 hours of really focused work today and tomorrow I can't. Maybe a social event that looks easy for someone else but costs me much more than it costs them. Maybe there are weeks when my body just needs more rest. Maybe there are environments where my brain works beautifully, then in others I would spend most of my energy simply trying to survive. None of those things tells me whether I am lazy, disciplined, successful, or failing. They tell me something about the person I am. And that is really what matters. And perhaps that is what all 5 of these life habits that have really been teaching me. The first one is check in with my own body. And the second one is learn about the way how I speak to myself. And then the third is tracking my own rhythms. And the fourth is being patient when I fall back into old habits. And the fifth one, I think is the most important one, is stop comparison. They are all different ways of doing the same thing, really, and that is learning to live with myself instead of trying to overcome myself. I still do not get this right every day. There are days when I ignore my body. There are days when I compare myself with somebody else and immediately feel like I'm behind in life. There are days when the old voice comes back and tells me that I should be doing more. I don't think decades of living one way disappears just because we finally understand where they come from. But my life feels so different now. Not because I have found a perfect routine that makes my neurodivergent brain function consistently. It feels different because consistency is no longer the only evidence I use to decide whether I am doing well. I thought I needed to learn how to function again. What I actually needed was to learn how I function. So if you are recently diagnosed or recovering from autistic burnout, and you are still trying to work out what life looks like from here, you don't have to figure all of that out straight away. You have spent years learning to measure yourself against a way of functioning that may never have been yours. Learning your own rhythm takes time. And maybe the first signs of progress will not look very impressive from the outside. Maybe it's about noticing that you are tired before you collapse. Maybe it's about eating before you become completely depleted. Maybe it's about catching one cruel sentence in your head and choosing not to believe it. Maybe it's about having a low energy day without turning it into a verdict on your life. Something else began to happen when I stopped measuring myself against the external benchmark all the time. For most part of my life, so much of my attention had been taken up by the things that I could not do. Why can I cope with this? Why can I keep up with them? Why does this affect me so much? Why can I just be more consistent? But once those questions became quieter, I started noticing things about myself that I had almost completely overlooked. There are ways my brain works that I actually like. There are things I notice other people seem to miss. There are ways I think, feel, connect ideas, or experience in the world that are innovative and extraordinary. You see, in the past, I spent so much of my life asking, why can't I? I became very good at seeing myself through my limitations. But now, I am beginning to think that knowing myself also means becoming curious about what is strong in me, what is unique in me, and what I would never want to lose. That does not erase the difficult parts, and there are definitely things about being a neurodivergent that actually makes life harder for me. But difficulty is not the whole story of who I am. And that's why I want to explore with you in my next video. It's about the things I have started to recognize in myself once I stopped using a neurotypical life as the measure of whether I was doing well. The things about my neurodivergent brain that I actually really grateful to have. Until then, be gentle with yourself. I am really glad that you are here.